So before we go into the actual pronunciations of the letter, let's first look at the anatomy behind these pronunciations, right? So I've got a picture of the jaw, right, the teeth and the jaw, and I've also got a picture of a sagittal section of the face, just showing where air and sound flows within the mouth and the nasal cavity. So if you look at the top, you can see all the teeth, right, and you can see how the ridges of the palate forms. So there's one important thing that I want you guys to notice, for those of you who aren't familiar with the terms that I may use in these videos, right? Because I'm a medical student, I tend to gravitate towards the anatomical terms. So this part here of the mouth, of the palate, where there's a dip in the palate or a recess in the palate, right? So it's hard palate, but when it goes upwards, right, towards your nose, that part is what we call the alveolar ridge, right? And there's a few Arabic letters that come from this part, that are pronounced from this part. Another thing to note is that these parts of the teeth, where the teeth attach to the gums, are called the roots of the teeth, right? So if you have your tooth, this is your tooth here, right? And that on the top, this is your gum. Where it attaches to the gum, that is the roots of the teeth, right? But where the tooth ends, that is called the tip. So when I'm referring to the tip of the teeth, I'm referring to this part here. But when I'm referring to the roots, I'm referring to the part where it joins to the gum. If you look at this bottom diagram over here, we have this area is where you have your larynx. All right, the larynx is called, also known as the voice box, and it's where the sound of your voice comes from, right? So air comes out here, right? You force air out of your lungs, and it gets changed and it gets transformed into actual sound in the larynx here, right? And then that's where the sound then exits, and either it will come up towards the oral cavity or it will come up towards the nasal cavity. Okay, and the way in which the sound comes out is affected by the position of the tongue, and is also affected by the positioning of your epiglottis. Because if you think about it, right, sound is a wave, and it goes up and down in a wave like this here. And for those of you who did physics will know that the amplitude of this wave, meaning the height basically of this wave, determines the pitch of the sound that comes out, right? So if you want a lower pitch of sound, you need to have a lower amplitude, and if you want a higher pitch of sound, you need to have a higher amplitude, right? So for example, a sound wave that looks like this here will sound higher pitched, right, compared to this sound wave here, which is lower pitched. So for certain letters, there are full mouth and empty mouth letters. An empty mouth letter has a higher pitch, right, and a full mouth letter has a lower pitch. So the back of the tongue, something very important to note before we begin with the pronunciations, is that the back of the tongue controls whether a letter is full or empty, right? Not the lips, as most people compensate for the back of the tongue by using the lips, which is incorrect, right? Certain letters are called full mouth letters. They are not called round mouth letters. A full mouth letter means that the amplitude of this wave, the pitch of the sound that comes out, is lower, resulting in a fuller sound, right? Not necessarily using the lips. So think about it this way. Let's look at the diagram. And if a sound wave comes out of here, right, it's got a amplitude like this, for example. Okay, now in this position here, you can see the tongue, the back of the tongue is upwards, right? Look at how small your wave is when it comes out of your mouth, right? And you can see the wave when it comes out of your mouth is focused towards the upper palate, right? That's how you know a sound will come out as a full mouth sound. It's because the amplitude of this wave is lower, right? And compare that to, for example, let's say the tongue was in a more depressed position, right? So let's say your tongue was flat downwards, right? This is your tongue and it's flat downwards. And now let's take a look at how the wave is going to change, right? So if your tongue is flat downwards, your wave is going to be able to bounce around from the top to the bottom, right? So you see when it comes out here, it's going to bounce up and down, and it's going to create a higher frequency, and therefore creating a higher pitch, right? So that means that your sound when it comes out of your mouth is going to have a greater effect on your bottom lip and your bottom gums, right? You're going to feel it at the bottom, and this is what constitutes an empty mouth sound. A higher pitch, a higher frequency means an empty mouth sound. So we start out with the first pronunciation, the first makhraj, which is called jawf in Arabic, right? Which means the emptiness of the mouth. And you can see in the diagram here, it is the junction of the oropharynx and the oral cavity, right? For those of you who don't know what the oropharynx is, the pharynx, which is the space behind your oral cavity, is broken up into three parts, right? This is the first part on the top, which is the nasopharynx. Then you've got the second part here, which is the oropharynx, which is what we're looking at. And then the last part, which is the laryngopharynx, which is down towards the side, right? So it is the place where your throat becomes your mouth. Basically, that's what it is, right? So this emptiness of the mouth that we're talking about, it's not anywhere close to the vocal cords, which means there isn't going to be vibration, right? And there isn't going to be any involvement of the tongue when we're using when we're pronouncing the sound. So your three open letters, your a, u, and e, open letters, come from this particular place, as well as your alif, right? So when you say a, alif, it mustn't be from the bottom, from to closer towards the larynx, right? It needs to be at this particular point where the throat becomes the mouth, the empty sound. It's an empty sound, there's no vibration to it. So once again, your open letters, a, u, e. You can hear no vibration in the voice, as well as alif, a, u, e. The second pronunciation that we have is called aqsal halq, right? So the letters of the throat, halq means throat. There are three parts to the throat, right? So there's a top, there's a bottom, and there's a middle. All right, so we're going to start from the bottom. The bottommost part of the throat, which is closest to the chest, is where the sound of a hamza and a ha will resonate from. So you can see here, lowest portion of the throat, which is closest to the chest, which is here. Now bear in mind, when the sound is made, even though the larynx is here in the center, now you may ask, okay, fine, the voice box is here and you told me the sound is coming out, how are we feeling the sound at the bottom? You must remember that sound is a wave, which means it can bounce out from here and come downwards, as well as the flow of air can move around within this tube, right, due to the different changes in pressure resulting from whether this pipe here is open or closed, right? So you'll feel the vibration of the ha and the hamza just above the sternal notch, right? So if you put your finger on your collarbone and you press upwards towards your throat, you'll feel that your finger will go like kind of inside into your throat, right? That is the sternal notch. So if you say ha, you'll feel the vibration in that point, right? It's somewhere around here, as well as your hamza, right? So remember, your heavy ha and your hamza both come from your bottom of the throat, which is called in Arabic aqsal halq. The next two letters that are going to come from the second part of the throat, which is the middle of the throat, which in Arabic is called wastul halq, right? Wast is for middle, al halq is for the throat. These two letters are the typical throaty letters, right? So your ain and your light ha come from these two parts, right? And it is at the same level as the thyroid cartilage, which is at the actual place where the larynx is situated, right? So it's at the point, your Adam's apple, you'll feel it, you'll feel the sound will come from there, your ain and your ha. You'll even feel when you're saying the ain, your Adam's apple will lift up just a little bit, right? So that is the point of pronunciation of ain and ha. The last portion of the throat that we're going to be talking about is the top of the throat, right, which is coming more closer towards the oral cavity, now the mouth, which is called adna al-halq, right? Adna for on the top or above, and al-halq for the throat. And these two letters that are going to come from this portion of the throat, they are ghoin and ha. Okay, let's first talk about the positioning of this pronunciation. So if you look at the diagram here, you can see that the top of the throat is nowhere close to the back of the tongue, right? There's all of the space here between those two portions, right? So there should be no back of the tongue involvement in either of these two sounds, all right? So let's talk about the ghoin first. The ghoin is a heavier sound than the ha, right? But then again, it's been associated with a gargling sound, which I don't necessarily like, because the gargling implies that there's involvement of the back of the tongue. When you gargle water in your mouth, the back of the tongue is because your epiglottis is closing this flap here, right? There's a part of at the back of the tongue that's here, which is called the epiglottis, and when it closes over here, it prevents basically any chow from coming down the esophagus. So when you gargle, that's what happens, right? But when you're pronouncing these letters, this is not going to be completely closed, which is why I'm saying it mustn't be associated with a gargle sound, right? So your ghoin is more of a vibration sound, right? And your ho must not have any back of the tongue involvement. So typically people will pronounce it like ha ha, right? You can hear that hard kind of back of the tongue gargly sound involved in it, right? What it's supposed to be is a ha, right? So you can hear it's actually closer to a ha than it is to how people are taught to pronounce it, right? If you don't understand the pronunciation of ha, go find yourself a goose and go chase it around, right? And when it chases you back, it's gonna make that sound, which is gonna help you understand how the sound is actually supposed to come out. Just a quick recap of the letters of the throat. You've got three parts to the throat. There's the top, the middle, and the bottom. There are two letters that come from each of these portions. So from the bottom, we've got our ha and our hamza. From the center, we have ain and we have ha. And from the top, we have ghoin and we have ha. The next makharaj is called aqsa lisan فوق, right? So أقصى اللسان means the back of the tongue, and فوق is for lower, or the furthermost portion of the back of the tongue, right? So the furthermost portion of the back of the tongue, you can see this bone here that they've shown is the maxillary bone, right? This is the front part of the maxillary bone. This part here is what they call the palatine process. Now, the palatine process is, yes, in fact, a bone, and there's certain letter, one more letter that comes from this particular point, this junction between the palatine process and the soft palate, right? Now, before that palatine process, way before that palatine process, is where your cough is supposed to come from. So if you put the back of your tongue up in your mouth, you can kind of feel the letter K in English is really pronounced from that palatine process, because of that that clicking sound that you can hear is because you're touching something hard, right? When you're touching the soft part, you're going to get a softer sound without airflow, right? So the cough comes from all the way back in the mouth, right? It's not a throat sound, it's a back of the tongue sound, but it must not have any airflow to it, right? So that is how you pronounce your cough, right? The back of the tongue must touch this soft palate right at the back here. Following the qaf, we have the kaf, right, which is the next letter that we're going to learn how to pronounce, which is also the back of the tongue, right? Aqsa lisan, but is the upper portion of the back of the tongue. So taht, closer to the front of the mouth, right? So we had fawq, which was at the back, and now we have taht, which is closer. Like how I said, the palatine process of the maxillary bone, where that point ends, right at the back of that point, is where you're pronouncing the kaf from, right? So it's very similar to the English pronunciation of the C, right? Not the K, the C. And as we can see here, it's on the apex of the palatine process, and it's very similar to the English C. If you say the word ka in English, ka, and then just put the F at the end, right? So kaf, that's how you pronounce kaf. Now, as you can see, we're moving closer towards the front of the mouth with these pronunciations, right? So we've dealt with the throat, we've dealt with the back of the tongue. Now we're going to be dealing with the middle of the tongue, wastul lisan. So there are three letters that come from the middle of the tongue. The three letters are jim, ya, and shin. Okay. Now, each of these letters have a special pronunciation with regards to the middle of the tongue, right? So let's look at jim firstly. Jim is pronounced when the centermost portion of the tongue goes up towards the palate. So let's say your tongue looks like this here. When I'm talking about the centermost portion, I'm talking about the middle of the tongue in terms of its length, as well as the middle of the tongue in terms of its breadth, right? So that point there, right in the center, is what will go upwards towards the palate and touch the palate, right? So when you say J in English, right, there's some side of the tongue involvement here, right? The sides of the tongue also go up when you say J in English. But when you say Jim in Arabic, it's more focused. So your tongue is like this here, and in the middle it goes up, and then at the back it's normal, right? So there's more focus towards the centermost portion of the tongue in an Arabic Jim, right? The next letter we have is the letter Ya. Okay, it's similar in its pronunciation to jim. The difference between jim and ya is that when you're pronouncing jim, the tongue will touch the palate completely. There's no gap between the tongue and the palate. When you're pronouncing the letter ya, there's a little bit of a gap, right? So let's say this is the palate, this is the tongue. There's a small gap here between the tongue and the palate, which allows for the sound of ya to be stretched ever so slightly. Right, and this is important. When we do sifat, you learn that ya is not a short letter like jim. Jim is a very short letter. Ya is a long letter. Okay, and the third letter is sheen. So sheen has its own sifat, which we'll do eventually, right? And basically what it says is your air that gets pushed out of your larynx here and comes upwards into this oral cavity, right? That air will be distributed within your mouth because of the position of the tongue when you're pronouncing sheen, right? So the air that comes forward, right, because there's portions of the tongue in the center that are upwards, preventing the sound from going through the middle and out of the mouth. So what happens is there's a diversion of sound towards the sides of the mouth, right? So that's what happens to the sound in the air when you're pronouncing sheen. You'll feel, even if you put your fingers outside of your mouth, you'll feel some airflow come out, but you won't feel airflow come from the center of the mouth, right? You'll feel from the sides of the mouth predominantly. So jim, ya, and sheen once again come from the middle of the tongue, all three of them, and in Arabic it's called wastul lisan.